we were holding steady, and now our rates just keep going up.
Yeah, we are in trouble.
Well, the doctors that I've talked to, and this is not part of any sort of formal presentation, but the physicians that I've talked to remind us that we're now into the winter season, which is the normal season for the
flu,
normal flus and other things. And given the propinquity with which so many people live in conditions that are cold and wet, if you're in the southern part of the country, you just have to expect the increase in infections and in actual what's the word I'm looking, not just the infection, but the actual demonstration of real symptoms, and that leads to other things, obviously. So the doctor I saw the other day said, just fasten your seatbelt.
Yeah.
Bob is now online.
Bob. You know,
Hi,
we can't see you though, Bob. You got a bright light behind you.
Yeah.
And you just see a silhouette of your head.
All right. I'll just change shift.
Yeah, you might want to turn that overhead light off.
Okay, Bob, so we are waiting for Francis.
Is that any better?
Yeah,
that's much better than before.
That's better.
Thanks. Nice seeing you all.
Hi, Bob.
Hi, Namata.
How are you?
Very well. Good. Nice seeing you. How is DC?
Not bad. We're here hanging in there.
All right.
Yeah. You got your protest shoes on?
Yep. And my mask.
Yeah. That's what people seem to be leaving behind.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hi, Nelima.
We can't hear you, Nalima. Are you
Good morning.
muted? How are you?
It's morning over here, so I keep saying good morning.
I know they forget how early it is for us. It's only 8.
Yeah.
Only.
It's only 8.
Well, I'm glad it's 8 rather than 7, because in my original calculation of the time difference, I thought I was going to have to be in front of my computer at 7.
Well, it's 7
I
over
was quite
here.
happy. Yeah. So it's 7 for you. Yeah. So.
Minnesota is 1 hour behind.
Yes.
Okay. Bob, so I was saying we are waiting for Francis.
All right.
I probably should call him and just get a sense of where he is. Because we are running out of time.
Yeah, sure. We're
on live. We're getting comments that participants can see us, but they can't see each other. I guess that's the format we're following.
Yes.
The format is that you see the panelists, but not quite the attendants.
No, that's fine.
Let me see whether I can get Francis here.
Sure. No, but I think our the attendants should just be a little patient as we nail down Francis, and then we should get started. And perhaps also to mention that it's nice seeing Brooks. We've been reading your articles in the Daily Maverick.
Good on you. Good on you.
Right.
I have to, when I write these things, I have to somehow find the middle ground between outrage and hysteria.
Well, this
you came very close to major outrage in one of those pieces.
Yeah, well, right up to the edge. And that's become my, in the last 4 years or so, that's become something of a stock position.
Right.
Right at the precipice and looking over the edge. But I mean, as you know, Bob, as you know, they're tailored to try to provide a wide-angle perspective for audiences, usually many of them in South Africa, Southern Africa, who don't necessarily have background on the issue or the topic concerned, but who have an interest in it. And so there's always an effort to try to provide that larger frame around any comment, any perspective, any conversation. But you know, it may read like that's easy, but by golly, that takes hours to figure out how you're going to do that without trying to sound like you're being cheesy or too too didactic all at the same time.
Right. No, certainly there is it's a fine balancing act.
I usually bounce it off my wife and say, "Well, what do you think?"
I think Gilbert is trying to say something. But he needs to unmute.
Well, that's going to be hard.
Francis is joining us in a minute.
Okay.
He was registered as an attendee, not as a presenter. So
All right.
they have resent him the link.
So will it be okay to start off with Nelima in the interest of time?
Actually, I think we should, because we are now 10 minutes late.
Right.
Should we start?
I think we can start.
Okay, good afternoon, good morning, everybody. My name is Gilbert Kariagala, the director of the Africa Center for the Study of the U.S. Very privileged to invite you to this event, a very critical event in these critical times, to unravel the meaning of George Floyd. I just wanted to say from the outset that the center was created about 2 years ago with the objective of, one, enhancing understanding of the US in Africa. So this event is very important in that respect. How do we get very good perspectives on the US from Africa? Secondly, we, as a center, we've been engaging in building partnerships with the American institutions in the enhancement of that knowledge around Africa and the US. So that's what we've been doing, building partnerships with many US institutions in order to fulfill that big objective. But finally, the objective of the center is to build the next generation of Africanists interested and knowledgeable about the US. We are the only institution in sub-Saharan Africa that is actually doing that, the promotion and the education of the next generation of Africanists who will be interested in the United States. So I'm very happy to welcome everybody to this forum on as I said from the outset, a very topical subject. In the context of the COVID pandemic, we have been forced to revisit an old pandemic, and that is the pandemic of race relations in the US, exemplified by the murder of George Floyd. So this pandemic also has, in fact, resurrected a global movement around Black Lives Matter. So if we could say the ray of hope around George Floyd is the mobilization and the galvanization of a global movement around race. And we see this happening across Europe, Australia, and even Africa. So we are very excited that it is an event that is of monumental significance to the world as a whole. And we are very excited, therefore, to have very distinguished speakers to come and unravel the mystery of George Floyd and the meaning of George Floyd in these contemporary and dangerous times. I think we are not going to waste that much time. I want just to go straight into the first session of our Zoom on George Floyd. The first speaker is Nelima Sitati Munene, who is the Executive Director of the African Careers, Education and Resources based in Minnesota. She is an advocate on women's issues, on youth empowerment, and social advocacy. She's been working in the Minnesota area for quite a while. And so she's going to give us the first presentation on the meaning of George Floyd from the perspective of where in fact she is. And so I'm very glad, Nelima, to welcome you to give you a 10 to 12 minute presentation, please, if you could get going. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. My name, as has been said, is Nelima Sitati Munene. I'm the Executive Director of ACSUS Inc., and I am based here in the Twin Cities of Minnesota. And so today I'm going to talk about what the murder of George Floyd has meant in the state of Minnesota, and also especially to the African community, the Black community, and also to our state, to our state in general. And I am going to find out, I'm trying to find out here real quick if I can, if it's possible to share my screen over here. I'm just going to go ahead and go ahead with my PowerPoint presentation. I'm not sure that I'm able to share my screen. And so the purpose of our conversation today is about making sense of the killing of George Floyd. And as I contemplated how to have this conversation, I realized that it is very difficult. It is very difficult to make sense of this killing, because it is a very senseless killing. And in trying to wrap my mind around this, a lot of what we have been grappling around in the Twin Cities is how did this happen in Minnesota? Not that it has not happened before. We have had police killings, but if you know anything about Minnesota, there is this sense in Minnesota that Minnesota is a pretty good state, very successful state. We have a growing immigrant population in the state of Minnesota. Minnesota likes to pride ourselves that they're one of the states that opened itself up to resettle a lot of refugees who are fleeing their home countries in search of safety from political turmoil. And so we have a significant Southeast Asian community, we have a significant Somali community, we have a significant Liberian community. And in the recent years, we also pride ourselves as the state that actually, can elect immigrants and refugees to Congress, to the United States Congress. And so Minnesota has created and crafted this narrative about itself that became very severely challenged by the murder and killing of George Floyd. And so what does that mean to us as a state? And so first, I want to talk about a timeline of events that have happened so far. So on May 25th, George Floyd died in police custody. On May 26th, responding officers were fired as protests began across our state. On May 27, the protests began to spread to other cities. And on May 28th, the governor of Minnesota activated the National Guard to put troops on the ground to control the unrest that had arisen. On May 29th, the officer who was responsible for George Floyd's death was arrested and charged. This was 4 days later after the incident, which was unprecedented. On May 31st, the prosecution changed hands. Attorney General Keith Ellison was appointed to take over the case of charging the police officers. On June 1st, we received the public was made aware of the autopsy results in the murder of George Floyd. On June 2nd, there was a civil rights charge filed by the Minnesota Department of Human Rights against the Minneapolis police. By June 3rd, all officers had been charged in the death of George Floyd, all the officers involved, all the 4 of them. On June 7th, the Minneapolis City Council members, with a unanimous, not unanimous, but a supermajority, 9 Minneapolis council members announced their intent to replace and disband the Minneapolis Police Department. On June 8th, the Congressional Democrats introduced a policing reform bill. On June 9th, George Floyd is laid to rest in Houston, and on June 10th, George Floyd's brother is at a congressional hearing testifying on policing reform. And so all these events have happened within a time span of less than 1 month, which is unprecedented, not only in Minnesota, but throughout the United States. And so a little bit of background, like I said, about Minnesota. Minnesota is a tale of 2 states, because on the one hand, Minnesota is a state that boasts as having one of the best living conditions and quality of life in the nation, but it also has one of the worst racial disparities in the nation. So for example, 31% of Black, Indigenous, and children of color achieved reading proficiency in 4th grade, and this compares to 56% of all students. The wealth gap between Blacks and whites in Minnesota is the 4th worst in the nation. We also have the largest gap in home ownership between Blacks and non-Blacks compared to the rest of the nation. And in the state of Minnesota, Black people are 5.5 times more likely to be arrested for very minor crimes, such as the possession of marijuana, as compared to their white counterparts. And so we're a state that, that has 2 stories to tell in terms of the quality of life and the success of our state, depending on who you're talking to, and and it's purely based on your race. And to me, Minnesota represents the quintessential experience of racial experience of America. And in Minnesota, we like to say that the systems are working exactly how they were designed to work, because these were systems that were founded on the basis of white superiority, that were mainly put in place to serve a predominant white population and have the tendency to leave people of color, and especially the Black population and indigenous communities, behind. In the context of the George Floyd murder, there has been a lot of conversation about the use of police force, not just within the Minneapolis Police Department, but also across the state. And this is a conversation that has lived within communities of color for a long time, and especially in the Black community. So the conversations that are happening now are what we have always known as people of color, and especially as Black people in the state of Minnesota, that it has not been safe for people to call the police, especially if you're a person of color, and especially if you're a Black person in a Black neighborhood. And Minnesota has had a history of racial inequalities. So with the recent tensions and protests, what this has led to is people thinking about and remembering about the Plymouth riots of 1967. So in July of 1967, there was a protest on Plymouth Avenue, which is right in the epicenter of a historical Black neighborhood in North Minneapolis. And so the protesters' grievance was about police brutality. So this issue of police brutality is something that has lived with the Black community for a long time. And the community at that time proposed some solutions around how they wanted to live their lives and how what they perceived would be some of the solutions to address the issues that we're raising. And those solutions centered around providing a different model of policy that humanizes Black people. And so how Black people are perceived in Minnesota has always been a question and has always been on the table when it comes to conversations of, you know, whether it's disparities or racial inequality in housing and etc. However, at that time, the city's framing was that they felt that in order to prevent a recurrence of the riots, the city should put more beat patrols on the ground so that they could establish a better relationship between police and Blacks. And as we can see, this solution was not successful because there have always existed tensions between the police and the Black community. And so as a community, and especially as an African community, what does this mean, especially for the African community? So a lot of times as African immigrants, we like to have this conversation in the United States about, so when did you discover, you know, you were Black? Because we come from an environment where we don't necessarily, especially for those of us who are born and raised outside the United States, you know, where we don't, our identity is not necessarily centered around, you know, our race or the color of our skin. It's centered around our nationalities. And, you know, if you at a country level, it's centered around what tribe we're from. But then you arrive in the United States of America, and then you are confronted by this reality about how everything is really centered around race. And so as an African immigrant and for the African immigrant community, which is significant in Minnesota, especially in this moment, we're grappling with the issue about how does this impact us? What are the underlying nuances? And there's a lot of conversation about, is the African immigrant experience really different from the African American experience? And to some extent, it is. You know, African Americans have the historical context of race because they were born and raised in this country and have experiences which are significantly different to some extent than, you know, than those of us who are African immigrants, and especially for those of us who have come, you know, into this country. And, you know, the way we are oriented into the United States plays a significant role about what our experiences, you know, tend to be, whether it's in this country and especially, you know, in the state of Minnesota. And so as a result of this unrest and the killing of George Floyd, there are a number of things that have come up in terms of policy. And what has taken center stage in this conversation has been this long-term conversation about criminal justice reform. So one of the major things one of the major conversations that is going on around the country, and especially in the state of Minnesota and in the city of Minneapolis, is about that centers around police brutalities. There has been a very loud and clear call from the community to defund the police and to disband the police. And so these are very lauded statements and are very controversial, you know, to say the least. And so what do these two statements mean? So when the community is talking about defunding the police, what the community is saying is that they would like to see a reduction in resources that have been made available to the police to harm communities. And instead, how can those funds be redirected to reinvest these resources in, especially in the communities that are currently have been divested from? And most of these communities happen to be communities of color and especially Black communities. The second statement, disbanding the police. And what this statement means is that community is interested in seeing a creation of community response to community problems. And so that this will serve, what this will do is it will reduce the exposure of people to police and hopefully reduce a lot of the police brutality that is happening, and especially the discrimination that people are facing in the hands of police. Also in the state of Minnesota, as a result of this incident, this in a few hours, actually, the governor of Minnesota will be convening a special session of the Minnesota legislature, and there are an unprecedented 17 bills, bills on the table to that are going to address criminal justice reform. And so I just want to highlight some of the main ones. And so one of the main policy reforms on the table is about the banning of chokeholds used by police officer. There's a prosecutor reform so that the Attorney General will be able to litigate any officer involved cases. There is the arbitration reform. There is the residency requirement for police officers, and also there's a huge push to have community-led public safety measures put in place to reduce police encounter with community members. One of the most significant policies that is on the table is this issue of voter restoration. So in the state of Minnesota, we have even though we're one of the states that participates the most in elections, we have a significant low voter turnout, especially when it comes to the Black community. And that is there are various reasons, for that. But one of the biggest issues is about, felonies not being able,
Elima, 2 minutes.
Sure, about felons not being able to vote. And so the proposal that is forward that would allow individuals with felony convictions to have the civil right to vote is a huge one. It's a huge one for our community right now, because it will allow so many people who have not been able to vote in the past and are currently not able to vote to be able to vote. And the other big policy issue that is on the table is people are really beginning to define that in order for us to achieve public security, we have to talk about economic security. So people are really uplifting the issue of we need to have policies and measures in place that are going to ensure that people are housing secure, people have access to healthcare, and that is what we see as a sure path to ensuring that we have the public security that people so desire. And so in that context, definitely the question about reparations has become very much alive and well in our communities, because the reality is, if we look at the historical context, is that the Black communities in the United States has never been made whole, post-slavery, post-civil rights movement, post-Tulsa, Oklahoma. And so the question about reparations is very much alive and well within the Black community right now in the United States. And so I will end my comments there and be open to questions later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nelima, for that overview on what is happening on the ground, and we appreciate your contribution. Let me now move on to Francis Carnegie. Francis is a senior fellow at the Institute of Global Dialogue here in Johannesburg, and he's been working for many years on African-American issues, Africa-US relations, and is now doing a big book on African-Americans globally. Francis, if you could just come in with your presentation, please.
Okay, thank you, Gilbert. And I want to thank you and Bob for organizing this important, very timely discussion. And I'm glad that you guys could sort of bear with me as I'm still adapting to the new communications environment that we're in these days because of the lockdown. Having said that, let me say first, I want to start out by saying that the national and global outpouring of protest in response to the brutal killing of George Floyd and rapidly unfolding momentum for police reform is a positive sign that perhaps events are moving in the right direction with Trump, the Republicans, and the far right very much on the defensive, while Black Lives Matter has now become an iconic symbol of revolt against racist and colonial legacies the world over. I mean, I think this is quite an incredible phenomenon. But we have to be careful. My main concern has been in an election year, and perhaps one of the shaping up as one of the most crucial ever, the seeming disconnect between Black protests inspired by George Floyd's murder and the imperatives of political mobilization for Black voter turnout could prove self-defeating in realizing the urgent changes we want to see, not just in law enforcement, but more generally in the political, social, and economic challenges of race confronting African Americans. There has been a tendency for protests not to be placed in political and electoral context in acknowledging that the issue of the highly problematic relationship between the police and Black communities fits into a much broader power political struggle, if not actually an ongoing American Civil War between forces for progressive political, economic, and racial change and racist forces of conservative white reaction who want to prevent the magnitude of Black political and voter mobilization elected Barack Obama in 2008 and in 2012. The strategic objective based on the 2008-2012 experience is to destabilize, distract, and suppress Black electoral potential, which is centrally strategic to Democrats, while generating white backlash mobilization against Black aspirations and progressive change to the benefit of increasingly authoritarian white evangelical Christian nationalist Republican dominance through the Electoral College, which benefits minority rule against the popular vote. So we're now in an era now where we could very well see repetitive scenarios of Democratic popular vote, minority Republican minority electoral vote. However, this scripted pattern has, at least so far, not been borne out. From my vantage point, I think one of the most telling aspects of the political dimensions of outpouring of national and global protest in reaction to the police killing of George Floyd has been how events have so rapidly and radically reversed the pattern of white backlash to such protests, which up until now have tended to benefit right-wing reaction and Republican electoral fortunes in an election year. So in the space of less than 2 weeks from the time Bob initiated today's forum, my initial apprehension that these events would fit the pattern of police killings of unarmed blacks giving rise to Black Lives Matter protests that have to be factored into low Black voter turnout in 2016 that contributed to Trump's election have not materialized. Rather, the graphic nature of Floyd's murder witnessed nationally and globally has radically changed this backlash dynamic in favor of the Black Lives Matter agenda for major police reform, interacting with mass public disapproval of the manner in which Trump has incompetently responded to the coronavirus pandemic and its economic impact on average Americans. So what has emerged in very short order is something of a perfect storm of a convergence between a major national crisis in race relations and law enforcement, in health associated with COVID-19, and in terms of the coronavirus's economic impact and challenge of economic recovery. But while the congressional momentum for major police reform is unfolding, and it is uncertain where this will actually lead, since Trump will have to sign off on whatever passes both houses of Congress, or be overwritten if he vetoes what's legislated. It is important to bear in mind the propaganda misinformation war being waged by Trump and his allies. The leftist Antifa, anti-fascist movement is responsible for what violence, looting, and destruction has accompanied the protest, even though no evidence of this has emerged. While to the contrary, there has been a dangerous emergence of white militia groups associated with anti-coronavirus lockdowns attempting to exploit these protests with the encouragement of Trump. And systematic institutional racism in American law enforcement does not exist, has become the Trump party line mouthed by all of his officials, beginning with Attorney General Barr. This drama will, and in fact is feeding into the presidential and congressional election campaign, with an uncertain outcome in November, since, although Trump's polling numbers have been rapidly declining, the coronavirus impact on voting, as demonstrated by the chaos in Georgia just a day or so ago, and Wisconsin before that, could very well benefit Trump's reelection. On that note, however, it is a good sign that Black celebrities led by LeBron James have initiated the More Than a Vote movement, which will pair up with other voting organizations to register and turn out Black voters. So I think that's sort of my preliminary, quick and dirty, analysis of this situation at this moment. One that is really a fast-moving scenario. I would not. I don't think that in the short time Bob and I had our conversation that things would have changed so rapidly, but between then and now. But so I think we're very much at an inflection point, and we will just have to see how this continues to to pan out. But I do think, irrespective of the outcome of the election in November, I believe that the African American community is going to have to become much more organized and cohesive going forward in dealing with the challenges that we face, not just in terms of police reform, but we're going to have to look into issues such as community, community self-defense and protection of peaceful assembly, given the fact that we're now looking at organized white, domestic armed groupings that are intruding, into this landscape, allied with elements of the Republican Party and the far right. So I mean, we're really in a dangerous, we're really moving into a dangerous period. And I'll just leave it at that for right now.
Thank you, Francis, for those interventions. Let me now invite Brooke Spector, who is a former diplomat based in Joburg, but is also a public intellectual and a journalist. He writes a column for the Daily Maverick. Brooks, please, if you could jump in here.
Okay, thank you, Gilbert. And I'm glad to join the other participants and obviously the audience that is out there somewhere in cyberspace and the organization that has put this together. It's very timely, and I think it's worthy of our attention. Bob and Gilbert gave me the unenviable task of somehow explaining Donald Trump and Donald Trump's policies. And I hasten to add that I underscore that position. It's in all italics, it's in bright red, bold, all caps, that I'm not speaking on behalf of the president and his administration. I'm not speaking on behalf of the United States government. I've been out of government work for 17 years, and it's given me a chance to reform, heal, or grow, depending on how you like to think of it that way. But one of the things that we have to do, of course, is that we have to get inside Donald Trump's head, and we have to squeeze it a bit to get out all the relevant facts and fantasies that Mr. Trump brings to his version of what he's doing and why. Let me just start at the beginning, the early Donald Trump. There were three key influences on his early life, and one of them was Fred Trump, his father. The second was Reverend Norman Vincent Peale, a kind of populist Presbyterian preacher, almost in the style of the money church preachers and pastors that you see today. And if you were to distill his rhetoric, it would be something like godliness equals wealth, and wealth is a sign of God's love. And you'll see just how that bears on the way Donald Trump thinks about things. And third, Roy Cohn, an attorney, a take-no-prisoners lawyer, who had once worked for Senator Joseph McCarthy, the man who led an enormously angry and deeply felt anti-communist crusade in the United States during the 1950s and late 1940s. Now, Donald Trump grew up well-to-do in New York City, it's true, but he was never part of the city's elite. And New York City is particularly placed with a large group of well-off people. And in Manhattan especially, that the core of New York City, he was certainly not part of that club of property developer, business leader, community leader, philanthropic elite, much of whom were Jewish, but certainly not all of them. But Fred Trump and then his son, Donald, were never part of that inner circle. I mean, if those of you who think back to a story of Dickens, perhaps, with the little match girl outside the restaurant in the freezing winter, nose pressed against the window, hoping somehow to get inside to get a meal. That was the Trump family. They were never on the inside. They were always looking in from the outer side. And as a result, the Trump family and Donald Trump then, when he thought about the city, when he thought about the world, it was the kind of anodyne white world that you might have seen if you'd watched American television programs in the 50s and early 60s. By contrast, I mean, I realized this the other day, that Donald Trump and I both are about the same age, but those great formative moments in modern American history, the Vietnam War, the anti-war protest and movement, the civil rights struggle, and even the birth of feminism, they were all absent in Donald Trump's life. He didn't fight in Vietnam. He didn't join the army. He didn't join protests. He wasn't party to the civil rights struggle. And about the birth of feminism, about the only thing Donald Trump could say was that his Vietnam was his sexual antics in the club scene in New York in the 1960s and 1970. I swear, I'm not making that up. That was one of his comments. Moreover, having never participated in politics before 2016, or say, let's for the sake of argument, 2015, he had never had the chance to become engaged in the give and take, the alliances that politics forces one to engage in. That is until he and his followers literally co-opted the Republican Party away from its older, more conservative roots. The new movement that he took pride of place in capitalized on marrying a small bunch of, let's call them what they were, plutocrats, older, much more conservative Republican funders and backers, with a broader group of largely white voters, increasingly resentful, angry, and disgruntled about a demographically changing America and their perceived loss of influence, and the decline of their manufacturing jobs. Now, this married up with those who had a more direct, racially based understanding of politics. And you saw that in the fighting, let's not call it fighting, in the demonstration in Charlottesville a couple of years back with the white supremacists, neo-Nazi groups. And Donald Trump's comment about it was, well, there were good people on both sides. This is a man who does not find an inner core of principle in these things. Now, having won the election in 2016, the Trump mindset has been to ensure that every policy bore directly on ensuring loyalty to his core support group. Everything that he did was targeted directly to the core support with which he won the election. And it's never been more than 45% in popular opinion surveys. Rather than doing what most every other politician does automatically, that's building their support from this group to that group, trying to bring people in. As a function of this, Donald Trump's policies toward the economy have largely been those that will support his rich supporters, but also give the sense that all of those elite cosmopolitan snobs and their foolish ideas about ecology, the environment, public safety, workplace safety, all those things are being rolled back as we speak. And if you look at the list of regulatory regimens that have been changed, it's fairly awesome. With racial attitudes firmly tied to his own earlier life circumstances and no apparent need to change them or build on them, together with a kind of what we can only call fake muscular strength and masculinity. And remember, this is a man who never participated in the military, but who loves the idea of the military in an abstract kind of way. It's inevitable that he ends up uttering phrases like, when the looting starts, the shooting starts, or that he would want the space between the White House and St. John's Church in Lafayette Square cleared of demonstrators, no matter how violently it might have been done, so that he could pose with a Bible in front of the church for a photo opportunity. And for those of us who paid attention to the photograph, you'll note the Bible was upside down and backwards. Donald Trump finds a natural affinity and an allegiance with the marginalized, the conspiracy spreaders about that vast left-wing conspiracy eager to overthrow the country's established order, the Antifa and everybody else. And so he's been working overtime, at least in his perspective, to return the country to the world of, and I'll quote the name of the television show that I think somehow exemplifies the way he sees the universe, Leave It to Beaver, or perhaps Ozzie and Harriet. For those of you familiar with American television, will remember that, and equivalent television universes. But these weren't real, but they were the universe that Mr. Trump must have enjoyed and must believe are the ultimate truth. For a man who does not read history, does not enjoy debate or feel comfortable with ideas, and who is unwilling to engage with others outside his own ideological bubble, his political acts and statements during this current upheaval are almost inevitable. The Washington Post today, and I'll quote from them, they had an article and they said, let me quote this, it said, recent polling shows that Trump's harsh approach to the protests is not in sync with much of the country. A Washington Post Shar school poll released on Tuesday found that 74% of adults supported the protesters, including 53% of Republicans. A Monmouth University poll conducted from May 28th to June 1st found that while 17% said the actions of protesters, such as burning a police precinct in Minneapolis, were fully justified, 57% majority said the anger that led to these protests was fully justified. It seems to me that Trump represents the death rattle of an earlier America, said Eddie Glaude, chair of the Department of African American Studies at Princeton University. Everything he's doubling down on is precisely what we're trying to leave behind. And so the battle that is now being engaged is precisely a battle surrounding what kind of country we will be moving forward. And he's holding on to, with all of his might, this idea of America as a white nation. Harsh perhaps, but I don't think it's fundamentally untrue. And let me just complete the picture and say that Donald Trump, of course, is a man with little or no natural empathy for others less favored by the supreme deity, as he has been, true to his own early training. Right, Donald? Yes. For those of you who didn't recognize this, this is a stress relief ball in the shape of Donald Trump's head. My daughter gave it to me on a trip to Hout Bay. We couldn't resist it. It now resides on my desk whenever I get upset. Gilbert, I'll pass the baton back to you because I think you needed to make up some time, and I came in at about, what, 10 minutes?
Thank you very much, Brooks. I think we made up the time like a good pilot. We are right at the hour where we were supposed to begin our Q&A. I had suggested that you type out your questions on the chat, and right now there is a question. Can the presenters comment on the disagreements in American public debates concerning the nature that the protests have taken? This is a question from Felix Mutunga, one of our postdoctoral fellows. Francis?
Gilbert, who do you want to go first?
Nelima, on the protest, can you go first?
All right, I will go first, and clearly state my bias because I've been out in the streets protesting alongside everyone else. The protests did start here from Minnesota, and let me also address the initial question that Felix asked, which is centered around some people seeing the protest as violent and etc. So I think as an organizer, we always say there is a protest is a protest. There is no right way or wrong way to protest, and protests are about civil disobedience. And yes, I mean, what happened in this situation, and especially let me talk more about Minneapolis, there was where we clearly know, and there's enough evidence and also some arrests about, there was some infiltration. There's some infiltration of the protests by some anarchists and some white supremacist groups that were responsible for a lot of the burning of the buildings and etc. In Minneapolis, in particular, when you look at the corridors, that were destroyed. I mean, those businesses the Lex Street Corridor, the West Broadway Avenue, the businesses on the east side of St. Paul, majority of those businesses are owned by people of color, by the Black community, ethnic immigrant communities. And so nobody was out there, burning up their own community. Those are infiltration of anarchists, and some of them were from out of state, but that is not to say that we do not have white supremacist groups in the state of Minnesota. And so we do have them. And so it was mainly an infiltration. And even though, the violence, of course, is not condoned, people do understand that there was a justification for people to be out on the streets. And as I laid out the timeline, it yielded some results. The protesters were out on the streets for a particular reason, and the result of that was an unprecedented, series of actions at the rate and pace that community wanted to see, and there is still more that community wants to see. And the other thing I will add quickly is I want people to realize that, as Dr. Carnegie said before, Black communities and communities of color in Minneapolis and St. Paul actually had to form community groups to protect their neighborhoods, because it was not just on the streets. These white anarchists were in the communities at night, and there was no police. The police force was out on the highways, and to be honest with you, protecting white corridors, white property, during the protests. And the Black and the communities of color had to really form community, community watch groups that, some of them are still going on. Some of those watch groups are still staying up throughout the night to protect the communities.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Francis, would you want to jump in? But can you also address the second question, which is, will the protests lead to a greater voter turnout, especially among African Americans?
Oh,
you
okay.
alluded to that.
Yeah, well, let me start with that. One hopes so. I think that the potential, given the magnitude of momentum of the protests, it should do that. But that's going to be contingent on real concerted voter education and voter turnout, and that which is one of my really main concerns, because and I think that the Trump administration and the Republican Party are really have a vested interest in an election that is going to be as chaotic and as shambolic as possible. And I think this has a lot to do with the way they relate to the coronavirus pandemic. That the Trump administration has no interest whatsoever in managing the coronavirus pandemic in a way that that really protects the public, and that is taken into consideration in terms of allowing people to vote. And I mean, you see, it's very obvious in terms of Trump's opposition to voting by mail. And so I'm very concerned about this election. It could very well be that that Biden and the Democrats, will get the votes that they need to win the election, but it's far from certain given the chaos, and this is a chaos that is very much in the interest of Trump and the Republican Party and his allies. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, thanks. take that question also, the question on voter turnout, unless you want to pass, then we'll have the final question.
Well, let me just offer a couple of data points that I think are relevant. We need to keep in mind, all of us, that number one, elections in the United States are not they're national in scope, but they're run and administered state by state by state. That's one thing. And in some states, voter suppression efforts will be strong if possible. And in other states, those people who want voters, as many as possible, to show up will be preeminent. It's going to be a state by state struggle rather than a national issue in that sort of elemental way. Although obviously there'll be crossovers in all kinds of directions. But second, Donald Trump won the election with 24% of those people eligible to vote. He won not even half of those people who voted, but because of the peculiarities of the way voting takes place in the United States, he won in the Electoral College, which is complicated to explain, but nevertheless, the end result was he became what is generally called a minority president, although he continues to act as if he had won an overwhelming majority of the nation as a whole. But the first question which came up, and which I think we still need to go back to, in the statistics that I quoted in my initial presentation, remember, a majority of the people in the United States polled in the most recent polling, which was just a few days ago, a strong majority of all people said that the goal of the protesters was supported by them, if not necessarily burning police stations, but the broader social goal of protesters was something that they supported. And I think polling is going to continue to reflect that larger national agreement on the question. With regard to one of the things that Francis raised, and I take very modest issue, I don't think we need to worry too much about the white supremacists somehow trying to pervert or destroy the election, because this election, unlike almost any I can remember, is going to be one where legions of people are going to be paying ridiculously close attention to the way in which voting is carried out and the way in which voters are either pushed to the brink and not vote, or whether voters will be supported in their efforts to come and cast their vote. We're going to see much more voting by mail, even if the president and his associates wish to oppose it. And as a footnote, we should add that Donald Trump voted by mail in his last election, in his only election.
Thank you very much, Brooks. I think we are running out of time. What I would suggest we take a 5-minute break and then come back to the second and final session. I want to thank all the 3 presenters and the viewers who have stayed behind. So please just take a 5-minute break and we can come back for the second session. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you. So Brooke, yeah, okay.
I'm back. Yes, Francis.
Yeah, I was just wondering how it's going.
How's what going? Sorry, which thing?
Well, no, I was just how you're managing this this lockdown.
Oh, goodness gracious. The good news is that in back for the second session. Our first speaker for this session is Professor Namata Blyden, who is a professor of history and international studies at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. Namata was here about February when she presented on her new book on African Americans and Africa. So we are very happy that she could take the time to come and join us in this very important conversation. Nemata, please, if you could.
Okay,
I'll
I'm
give
going to
you a
share my
presentation.
screen. Okay,
Thank you.
all right. All right, can everyone see my screen? Can you see my screen? This is the first time I'm sharing on Zoom, so I hope everyone can see my screen and hear me. Hello? Can everyone hear me?
I
Yes,
think
we
we
can
can
hear
hear
you.
you.
All right, okay, because I didn't hear any feedback. Okay, so thank you for having me. Bob asked me to sort of speak on historical and contemporary. So this, I think of this more of being a rumination than anything else. So I'm going to start on a slightly pessimistic note with a little clip here, and I hope you can hear it.
Black Lives Matter is a job. You guys are not oppressed. You're lazy, that's all it is. Go get jobs, work. I am oppressed. The white people are oppressing me. Where are they to oppress you? You are the racist. The racist is you.
So what are you fighting for? What are you fighting for? You're not here to fight injustice. You're here to cause drama.
Will be stop violence. It's not about blacks.
Unicorn world. That's not a
Stop the
unicorn
violence,
world.
period. When the black person kill a black in a black neighborhood, they come out and they say, when the police comes, you know what they tell the police? Snitches get stitches. Snitches get stitches. But if a white person kill a black person, Black Lives Matter. Stop the hypocrisy. Nobody takes this seriously. Nobody. If it matters, it should matter in black neighborhoods. You start cleaning at home.
So why don't you go?
You
Why
start
don't you
your
start?
kids at home.
Why don't you start?
I'm not oppressed.
That's
I am
for you.
free.
Good for you. That's an individual person. What about a
Okay, I'll stop it there. So, you know, we've been all getting things on social media, and this is something somebody sent me on social media. And what's on the right side was also sent to me on social media, and I don't know where these came from, so the provenance is unknown. But I start with these two things, the clip and the little sort of statement to say that more work needs to be done in terms of a relationship between African Americans and Africa, particularly some immigrants in the United States. And Nalima spoke to this idea, right, of what some of us as African immigrants come with, the ideas that we come with, particularly about African Americans. So I was asked to sort of speak about this relationship in historical perspective. There's a long history in terms of the relationship between Africans and the United States. African Americans in particular is what I have studied. So whether we talk about the relationship in terms of the enslavement of Africans who were brought here, those first ones who came in 1619, we celebrated that last year. It was a big celebration. There's a significant African-American presence, what their contributions are to the United States. Late 19th, early 20th century, we see this increased engagement where Africans are coming to the United States, but African-Americans are also becoming more engaged with the continent, speaking on its behalf, whether they're missionaries, educators, the political exchanges with the Pan-African conferences, African students coming to study in the United States. That continues into the post-colonial period with the anti-apartheid movement and African-American activism on Africa's behalf, the lobbying of African Americans on behalf of Africa, things like the Congressional Black Caucus with the Africa interests, a whole host of engagements, specifically between African Americans and Africans, but perhaps between Americans and Africa broadly. Today, when we talk about African Americans in Africa, we largely maybe focus on the large African immigrant population. And again, Nalima spoke to that. So this notion of Africa speaking back, right? Traditionally, we think of America speaking to Africa, but I want to also think about the notion of Africa speaking back. So the next couple of slides are just illustrative of what I've just said. These are sort of clips from the African American press of the late 19th and early 19th century that's recording the relationship. Whether it's the donation by Ethiopia to Howard University, the African students studying at American colleges, or the entertainment, right? Asadatu Dafora was a dancer from Sierra Leone who lived in the United States. Also, we can talk about the relationship, as I said, in terms of activism. Um, and the examples that I'm using on this slide is the activism of the early 20th century with people like Paul Robeson and Alpheus Hunton. Most people sort of remember Paul Robeson as an entertainer and don't remember him as an activist on behalf of African Americans, but also on behalf of Africa. And so some of the quotes that I have here are by Robeson talking about his relationship to Africa, and that also of his wife, Eslanda Robeson, who actually traveled in Africa, and her relationship to Africa. Alpheus Hunton was a professor at Howard University who also was very interested in engaging with Africa. And the quote up here, fairly long, I won't read it all, was a response to a young person who asked, why should we as Black people in the United States be interested in Africa? And he says, you ask why one should worry about racial conditions in Africa. The answer is twofold. We have to be concerned with the oppression of our Negro brothers in Africa for the very same reason that we here in New York or in any other state have to be concerned with the plight of our brothers in Tennessee, Mississippi, or Alabama. He goes on to talk about the relationship and then end with Jim Crowism, colonialism, and imperialism are not separate enemies, but a single enemy with different faces and different forms. If you're genuinely opposed to Jim Crowism in America, you must be genuinely opposed to the colonial imperialist enslavement of our brothers in other lands. And that activism continues into our period, into the modern day, the 20th century. And so some of the kind of commonalities and common cause in terms of activism that we see between African Americans and Africa in the 20th century doesn't begin, but we can sort of date in these last 2 decades with the shooting of Amadou Diallo in 1990 and the way it brought together African Americans and Africans. You can see there Jesse Jackson and Al Sharpton, who spoke out quite strongly when Amadou Diallo was shot. In the picture, the black and white picture, that's a picture of Al Sharpton, who many of you heard speak at Gorge Floyd's funeral this week. And there he is with Amadou Diallo's mother, Khadijatu Diallo. Other sort of ways in which we see common cause happening between African Americans and Africans in more recent times, the Africa Legal, Human, and Civil Rights Center that was initiated in DC in 1999, the 2006 Black Alliance for Just Immigration, which I'll talk a little bit more in a minute. DC in 2006 also opened an Office of African Affairs. And of course, the role of African immigrants in the Black Lives Matter movement. And we can ask the same question about what is the role of Africans in the Gorge Floyd demonstrations, which of course, again, Nalima has spoken about. So the response to African immigrants is not a new one. If you were to read American history books, you would think that the first African immigrants started coming to the United States in the 1960s. That is not true. There's a significant African presence in the United States. We don't often characterize them as immigrants, but many came, they stayed, they married, they lived here as immigrants. During the era of Jim Crow, of course, they lived largely among African Americans. The slide that I have up there is a editorial or a sort of response to an alien bill that was passed in the early 20th century, or that was debated in the early 20th century. And this is Booker T. Washington, who we normally don't associate necessarily with activism on behalf of Africa, but he was. And he's responding to this bill which sought to limit and to prevent Black immigrants from coming in. And in this 1915 letter to the Washington Post, Booker T. Washington makes this appeal to the American Congress and to the people of the United States in favor of fair play and justice in connection with the immigration bill now pending before the United States. He characterizes it as unjust, unreasonable, and unnecessary, and makes the case for, in fact, not barring Black immigrants. The immigration debates typically in the United States, and that has continued in our time, arguably have focused on non-Black populations until Trump made his shithole comment. Many Americans probably did not even pay attention to the idea that they may have been Black immigrants in the United States. So contemporary immigration justice comes in the form of a lot of organizations, but one that's particularly active is BAJI, the Black Alliance for Just Immigration, which, as I said earlier, was founded in 2006 in response to repressive immigration bills. Its aim is to promote dialogue between Black communities. As it says on its website, the Black Alliance for Just Immigration believes that a thriving multiracial democracy requires racial, social, and economic justice for all. African Americans and Black immigrants are stronger together, and we can win by becoming leaders in the fight against structural racism and systemic discrimination. BAJI was formed to bring Black voices together to advocate for equality and justice in our laws and our communities. So there is this common cause, again, between African Americans and Africans in the realm of immigration justice. Here's another report that just came out. I couldn't find the exact date. It said January, and I think it was January. It might have been January of this year, although I suspect it was January of last year. A report that was put out on the state of Black immigrants. And it speaks to this idea that Black immigrants are, exposed, as it says on its website, to more risks and vulnerability. They too are subject to being stopped by police for minor offenses, traffic violations, etc. And it says when the police decide to take on the duties of federal immigration enforcement, they often use these stops to question people about their immigration status. So linking the police here again with immigration justice. This little section there on anti-Blackness says the government's increasing focus on immigrants with criminal records disproportionately impacts Black immigrants, who are more likely than immigrants from other regions to have criminal convictions or at least to be identified through interactions with local law enforcement. So the idea that Black immigrants are not spared, right? The police harassment that African Americans are, and again, it behooves African immigrants to understand that. And then, of course, the Black Lives Matter movement, which sprung up in the wake of the killing of Trayvon Martin in Florida. The founders are themselves very much diasporic in their orientation. Patrisse Cullors and Alicia Garza are Americans. Opal Tometi is a Nigerian American. They have a clear agenda for Black people globally. They stress the connections. They talk about Black Lives Matter as a call to action in response to state-sanctioned violence and anti-Black racism, which again impacts all populations, not just African Americans, but African immigrant populations as well. The last couple of slides, and I think my time is running low, but speak to George Floyd protests on the continent. We've seen in Ghana, Nigeria, South Africa, and I'm sure in other places, responses to the killing of George Floyd, with the idea that Black Lives Matter everywhere, not just in the United States, as Mukhtar Karim says. So some of the demonstrations are speaking to what's happening in the United States, but they're also linking it, of course, to what's happening to the continent. And Mukhtar Karim, in that quote, speaks to that notion. What are the politics of African responses to the George Floyd killing and to these demonstrations is a question I have. I'm not proposing an answer, but here's the response by the chairperson of the African Union, of course, strongly condemning the murder of George Floyd that occurred in the United States at the hands of law enforcement officers, wishing to extend his deepest condolences to his family and loved ones. And what can the response be of African governments who depend on American aid and things like that is a question I have. I have not heard strong, and that may be because I'm not keeping up, responses from African governments. So what are the politics of African responses on the government level to what's going on. And there are all sorts of African responses from other spaces. And here are some: African writers, African leaders, says joined by US embassies, condemn police killing in Minneapolis. So there you see, you know, this sort of speaking on against it, but in connection, if you will, with US embassies. What does that mean? Again, so a variety of responses from the African continent. Another response is one which we saw last year as we celebrated the 400 years of the African American presence, which was the welcoming hand that many African nations extended to African Americans to, quote unquote, come home. Ghana perhaps was the most successful, and I'm sure Michael will speak to that, of this homecoming, right? The idea that, well, maybe you should come back to Africa if things in America are not going so well for you. So we can think of that as an African response, not necessarily specifically to George Floyd, but we might ask, you know, as I do throughout my book, is this a moment when African Americans are looking to Africa as they've done during moments of stress in their history? And because I can never do a talk without referencing August Wilson, the playwright, who talks about the ways in which Africa prefigures in the African American imagination and in American life, and the ways in which African Americans should think about Africa, with this quote that there's an Africa in each of us that we have to get in touch with to understand our relationship to this society. He's talking about the United States. All we have to do, he says, is to claim that part of ourselves, which I think is the strongest part, our African American, Africanism. It has nothing to do with putting on beads or dashiki, but simply understanding who we are in the world, understanding our relationship to this society, and claiming a responsibility for ourselves and our salvation instead of letting other people claim that for us. And so I end with perhaps this question of perhaps this is the lens through which African Americans who are protesting in the wake of the murder of George Floyd should think about their relationship to Africa, using it to strengthen their agitation and their activism in the United States. Thank you.
Nemata, thank you very much for that broad and historical overview. And we now turn to Michael Sudakasa. Michael is the CEO of Africa Business Group, which is based in Johannesburg. It's an institution that fosters Africa's economic development, and Michael has been in South Africa for many years, but he's done a lot of work continentally, and we are very glad to have Michael to provide his input on this big issue of George Floyd and his meaning. Thank you, Michael. You take the floor.
Thank you very much, Gilbert, and colleagues and those tuning in. It really is a pleasure to have an opportunity to reflect, and I find these engagements also enriching because you learn different insights and things about contemporary issues that you weren't aware of, even though you consider yourself following closely. I wanted to share my remarks from the vantage point of diasporans who are repatriates, if you will. I've lived here in South Africa since 1999. And moved here for work, as many African Americans who are on the continent do, and have stayed. Not always sure, you know, will I stay here? Will I move back to the States? But this is de facto home, if you will. And I wanted to share a bit about the conversations that happen amongst diasporans who are on this side, looking back at all that's unfolded around Floyd. But again, you know, there's a comment that's made in a Denzel Washington movie, A Wreck on a Wreck. And the first days after the videos of how Floyd was killed came to light, and there was violence, but you didn't know, okay, now there's agitators. It's not just, you know, this could have been the '68 riots after, you know, King was killed. We said, but all these people are leaving. We're in the middle, just as context, in lockdown. And our lockdown has been slightly reduced, but has not been, we're not all fully back out and about. And so our biggest concern for most of this year had been health and the health of our families who live in the US, where we watched a very disjointed approach to trying to deal with the pandemic. And now you had this compelling pandemic on top of a pandemic. As Gilbert said, we have a even longer standing pandemic that we're dealing with that forced people into the streets. And so part of you was like, well, what's going on? Are people, they're not social distancing. I mean, again, we're getting the news on the benefits, et cetera. And as we started unpacking what happened, it became, well, look, yes, COVID might kill you, some percent of us, but police may kill us faster. So, we have to stand up right now for this issue. So we had those conversations, mostly in chats and WhatsApps and bilateral conversations, but it made a number of us think about, these were the things that we didn't mind leaving when we came to the continent. There are issues of race here in South Africa, but if you get pulled over by the police and you're male or female, chill doesn't go down your spine that, hey, this could be my last encounter if I don't have my papers, if I don't put my hands up, if I don't, all those rules that govern engagement, because you are now in a majority situation from being in a minority one, you kind of relax on. So it made a lot of people think about, well, whew, glad I'm on this side. I mean, we were having some of these conversations around COVID because, again, South Africa, our cases are spiking, but we had done fairly well in terms of addressing it. And people were like, oh, well, I'm avoiding that. The other thing though that came through your mind was my family. This is an interesting phenomenon because there's no flights traveling unless you're trying to be evacuated out. So even if you wanted to go home, quote unquote, to the States to check on, and I have kids and they're all in the States, check on the kids, you physically could not. Similarly, I had talked to my son who's in college, his school was closed, I'll have you come over to South Africa. None of that happened. So there was this bit of, I'm connected, but I'm disconnected. I can't really engage. How can I help? What can I do? So you're watching CNN 24/7, trying to see this thing unfold. The other thing is we're African-Americans, but we're also Americans. So you're having conversations with friends that are on this side who are African, and they're asking you, well, what is going on in the US? And the place seems to be burning, it's on fire. And you're trying to explain historical and systemic racism, and which is not an easy conversation because race in the South African context, it's not taboo, but we just don't talk about it all the time because we're in the majority, but in the economic minority. So it's still, 94 was not that long ago. So sometimes it's like a wound that's trying to heal, but if you get into race discussions, you rip it off. So now you're forced to, engage in some of these things. You have Africans on this side who, they weren't as similar to the ladies that Namonte you started off with, but they were saying, hey, that's not my issue. That's in America. Then there were some who would be in the chat saying, no, what happens to African Americans is our issue. And, we did make note of the fact that the AUC chairperson spoke up right away. The president of Ghana, okay, right away, May 29th, June 1st. But they lent their voices, and that was, I can't remember another time when the AUC head spoke out against racial injustice in America that boldly. I think the president of Ghana's remarks picked up on where you left off in terms of that olive branch. I mean, they had a funeral for him 2 days ago. I think it's the only country on the continent that actually had a ceremony. They're building a statue for Gorge Floyd. So we're paying attention to the welcoming of the diaspora, and both the African diaspora, mentor of mine, Ali Masri, used to talk about American Africans as the opposite of African Americans. So most of the conversation about diasporans on the continent had been to engage with American Africans who went to the US of their own free will. Now it seems like that conversation is expanding. I think the other point that kind of came up in our thinking was because Africans were saying, well, what about our leaders? How our leaders treat us, as Africans? They're heavy-handed in different countries, and there's a cartoon where the president is, or someone from the government is holding a Black Lives Matter sign while he's got his knee on the African who's of his own country. So those issues are playing out, but we're encouraged by all of the widespread, and it's global. I think, in this day and age of cell phone cameras and instant media, it's just spontaneous. And so, we're now on day 12 or 13 of protests, and they're still going. And the conversation is still going. Many thought after the first 3 or 4 days and the curfews came, the president of the US was talking about bringing the militia to the street, the military, going to squash this. And now we're shifting into this. There's going to be some longer term reform that happens. Those of us who, one of the things you miss when you're on this side are US sports. So one of the biggest sporting leagues that has been in our discussion is the NFL, because Colin Kaepernick was basically blackballed from the league because he took a peaceful knee. Now we're rioting in the streets, and the NFL is like, oh, we were wrong. We're pledging $250 million for the next 10 years to help. I mean, you feel like, okay, that's a step, but now it's not enough. You got to do more. So we talk a little bit about, and we're hoping that this also transcends into, we talked about civil rights, we talked about political rights. Now we need to talk about silver rights. I mean, many of the repatriates, to repatriate from the US to the continent is not something that can be done without some resources, because it's not a happy, easy landing. And so many of us have come for work. Some were, in corporate America, others were entrepreneurs. But the idea that we're seeing, and we're hoping that more African Americans are seeing, is that how do we rebuild? We've spent a lot of time reliving what happened in Oklahoma when they burned down Black Wall Street. How do we rebuild our own? We don't want to be segregationists, but we want to say we need to have the tools to play in the US, period. And this is at least for the next 25 years. I mean, apparently it's 2045 when America will become officially majority minority. And so the pushback, and that's all that I can think that it is, to, in essence, the marginalization or the fear of being marginalized by white America is going to be there for the next 25 years. And so how do you engage? Well, part of it is having your own resources. I mean, we were disproportionately affected by COVID, disproportionately affected by the job loss that's come from COVID. And, the conflict, if you will, that's happening in the turmoil in the economic sphere in the US is also disproportionately affecting us, and likely to disproportionately affect us. So we're hoping that the civil rights agenda will raise. Another thing that we're cognizant of is that there's a lot of new voices to those of us who live on this side of the ocean. And that point that was mentioned, there doesn't seem to be one leader, quote unquote. You think about, well, where's Jesse Jackson? We're like, oh, but Jesse's almost 80 years old. I mean, he does speak out. I heard Andy Young speak out. But that ilk of leader is, people were asking, where's Louis Farrakhan? I mean, people, just people who in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s were quick to speak up on these issues are not on the scene. And then there's some young people who are taking the helm, often from local pulpits, if you will. We asked, where's the NAACP? Some of our institutions, do we have an institutional way to address these issues? Because the Black Lives Matters is a movement, but to the point that Francis mentioned, didn't translate that power and support into the polling booth. And we're equally minded that this year is an election year. We think about how can we support the election process, vote from abroad, and many of us Democrats abroad. Those things are top of mind during this period, and we're trying to grapple with those. Lastly, and it's one of the points that you mentioned that was promoted by Ghana very successfully, which was repatriation to the continent. And we ask ourselves, will this period in the US of turmoil encourage some to think about relocation? And I won't say the beauty of, but the way things have turned out, you can't jump on a plane and leave. Everybody's got to kind of deal with the issues that are there right now for the foreseeable future, for at least a few months. You're not making a knee-jerk decision about these things. But some have talked about writing guides for people who would like to come back. I mean, there are stories about, again, American Africans who come back and they don't find it the same way they left it, and so they end up back in the US, and African Americans who've come over and they haven't found it exactly the way that they thought it would be, and they've gone back. So I'm not sure it's a panacea, but the idea would be, if you wanted to come, how could we make it easier for you to come? I mean, the continent is still, the fastest growing continent in terms of population. It's the youngest continent. That latter part is key because we don't have enough jobs now. So when you come, the idea is that you will come and help create more jobs, not come and be thought of as someone taking other people's jobs. But the idea that there's a global Africa, if you will, or a global Africa economy that people on both sides of the lake, if you will, that's what we like to call it, are yoked to, is growing. And you can't turn a blind eye on the continent to what's happening to people of African descent. The other thing is, Nimati talked about the growing size of the African population. So what I started seeing here, reading the paper, were Africans who had gone to the US to study and who'd come back to the continent, but had had an incident in the US where they were pulled over or they were treated like an African American. And then their accent gave them, well, you're not from around here, so we're gonna treat you differently. But you saw what African Americans deal with often. And so there's a certain empathy that exists now that might not have been there in the past. So, I think that it is definitely a period of awakening and reckoning. But we're not done. So, those of us, who have legal backgrounds, I'm thinking you need legislation. You're going to need more than the protests to make these changes, the change that we'd like to see, more permanent. You need change, I think, at the ballot box, because the things that are happening that last almost a lifetime are the appointments of judges, for example, to the Supreme Court, to the circuit, the districts. If we don't change those things, then the tools that govern the US, Nalima, you talked about that the policy in Minnesota was working the way it was designed. Well, to undo that, it's going to take a lot more than, kind of shoe leather and protest. And so we're, again, on this side of the ocean, thinking about how do we celebrate Juneteenth next Friday and raise the profile of some of these quintessential African-American experiences, if you will, in the context of our adopted home here on the continent. And I think you've got communities in Kenya, communities here in South Africa, communities in Ghana of a significant size that people think about these things and have conversations about these things. So, it definitely is that period where, I grew up studying history, and people talked about, people who were lynched or, kids who were killed, way before my time, but they were part of history. And you feel like Floyd was going to be part of history in terms of what's happening and the reactions to it. And we're all, watching closely at how the government reacts. A lot of the protests on this side of the ocean have been in front of the embassy, or in front of embassies. That's the place to go and protest too. And interestingly, the head of the State Department hasn't said anything. So it kind of left the officials, that are the diplomats on this side, kind of everybody's on their own to say what they want, which is not a great position. So it also, to some degree, for those of us who feel this way, this lack of leadership in this crises and these crises, direct on direct crises, is compounding, from our vantage point, kind of a negative portrayal of the U.S. It's kind of like it keeps going down as opposed to becoming great again in this crisis. So I'll stop there, but appreciate any questions should they come.
Michael, thank you very much for that perspective. The dilemmas of the diaspora, if we could just retitle it, but thank you again for your contribution. Can we start having your questions? We are now going to have the last speaker for this session and for the day, but if you could start writing those big questions so that when Bob finishes, we have good questions for our discussion subsequently. I want to invite Bob Wekesa, who is the Director of Research and Partnerships for the Africa Center for the Study of the US. Bob doesn't need any introduction. He's been very key to this event and to most of the events that we've been having. And he has volunteered to give African perspectives or perceptions of Africa, perceptions of the Floyd issue from an African perspective. So Bob, if you could take the floor and then we'll wind it up.
Thanks, Gilbert, and good morning, good afternoon, colleagues. As Gilbert does mention, my interventions, my thoughts here are indeed reflections, and as reflections, they need not be very scientific, because they are indeed reflections on a fluid, dynamic, ever-changing situation. We are living the moment, as it were. And for that reason, I shouldn't be pinned down if I mentioned anything perhaps not very empirical or not very scientific. In addition, the discussion, the topic I'm focused on is one that is open to interpretations from various perspectives, particularly because when you talk perspectives, you're actually talking angles, positions that people take. When you talk sentiments, it depends with whose sentiment, and sometimes those can be very controversial based on where one is entering the conversation from. But the first point I would like perhaps to share and point out is that I'm drawing lots of my reflections from social media and from popular media, mainstream newspaper, TV, television that are African, based on some initial observations. And obviously social media, if you're on the African continent, you realize WhatsApp has become such a major platform, and yet is discrete in a sense because it's a group, as it were. Obviously Facebook and Twitter too. Those can be the starting point for our figuring out sentiments and perceptions. And one of the key perceptions and sentiment that has come through from all these various social media is that the African continent and Africans generally on the continent have not reacted as robustly to the murder of George Floyd as have Americans themselves, obviously because it's on American soil, but also in parts of Western Europe. If you compare the protests that happened in London, in Berlin, in Brussels, in Paris, and you compare that to those that happened in Accra, in Lagos, in Nairobi, in Johannesburg, in Harare, they were not nearly as robust, as big enough, as it were. And in one of the WhatsApp group, which actually happened to patronize with Gilbert, the question was why? And I think one of the immediate response was that Africans, a certain level of Africans are actually poor, as it were, and they are not even wired, because to some extent, the protests are a form of digital activism. They are being delivered through gadgets. that many on the African continents in the informal settlements, in rural settings, might not even have access to. Let's not forget that for for parts of Africa, in fact, they are not just connected. We talk of the digital divide, and the digital divide actually also then becomes a knowledge divide. So much so that for certain levels of Africans, particularly those at the lowest level of lowest strata of society, they might be at sea as to who George Floyd is in the first place. So much so that if you went to my home village in Western Kenya and asked my grandmother if she's heard about George Floyd, it was like, she might actually respond to say, now who the hell is Floyd to start with? So at least at that point, we can then understand why perhaps the response is not as robust from the African continent. But then we have a second level of society on the African continent where we should have expected much more higher levels of response. And this is the African middle class. We have seen lots of data from the World Bank, from the African Union and so forth, demonstrating that Africans are climbing up the social and economic ladder pretty fast. These are Africans that will be like like anybody else in the world. You know, they have access to all this gadgetry, to the internet, and they have good education. And therefore, we should have seen quite some robust kind of activism even on the platforms, yielding offline protests, so that we should have seen, at least in Nairobi, if not at least 2,000, 3,000 people on the streets. In Lagos, a city with nearly 30 million people, even getting 5,000 people on the protesting would have been a good thing. So why not? And at that point, then, some of the factors that emerge are, one, that the middle class in Africa is also just subject to the governance system as the rest of African society is. So much so that in the current COVID-19 circumstances, there's been so heavy militarization of society, to the extent that allowing protests is not quite there. And that's just one point. But the second point that emerges when you look at the discussions online is a more problematic one. And this is that this is an American problem and is not a continental problem. I'm not saying this is the uniform sentiment that comes through, but this is actually a sentiment that, in fact, both Nemata and Michael did touch on in a sense, in saying, look, we are Africans. We are not African American, and we do not associate with that. But even more insidiously, there's the sentiment that, in fact, Africans on the continent and African Americans have their own, in quotes, beef. And this will come from, for example, just to give you a more anecdotal example, is that in one of the WhatsApp group that I participate in, which is a University of Nairobi class of 98 group, there's a colleague of ours who lives in Los Angeles. And she was saying, look, Africans are better off associating with whites rather than African Americans, because African Americans don't simply like them. And I think the question of accents was mentioned earlier by Michael. And that was pointed out that if it will seem like Africans and African Americans look alike, the moment an African opens their mouth in Los Angeles, they will be identified as such. And African Americans then will say, no, look, you're not really part of us, And I think earlier in February, Nemata did make a presentation of such sentiments being institutionalized. So I'm just wondering aloud, if the sentiment that this is an American problem and that there actually are issues between Africans and African Americans, as we see expressed on some of those social media platforms, is actually an issue that is worth considering, or is it a one-off issue? I think I'll also then move on to the point, to the third level, really, as I go towards the end, which is at the higher level, at government and leadership level. And actually, this then will be tied, in a sense, to the point I made earlier, which is that the higher level of traction in terms of protest in Western Europe might have been because there were community leaders committed to the Black Lives Matter theme. On the African continent, there might actually be the lack of leadership at that level on a global Africa kind of perspective. Whether it is on the basis of ignorance or averseness or just some phobia of some kind is a matter that we can perhaps investigate. But it is obvious that in places where protests have been successful, whether in the US or Western Europe, it is because people were committed enough to go out, sit down and plan, and then take action by going into the streets. That kind of organization has not really been seen on the continent. We've seen a number of African public intellectuals, and I think by now many people are familiar with PLO Lumumba because he has a kind of motor mouth. He talks pretty fast and furious, as it were. The former African Union ambassador to Washington, D.C., Arikana, has also come up. The likes of Julius Malema in South Africa. They have expressed their sentiment, but they have not really gone out of their way to say now, tomorrow or the next week on Wednesday, we are going to organize a march, say from Johannesburg Central to Pretoria, or if that is too far, then to the consulate in the near Sandton. And therefore it will appear that we have a lot of us who are good at speaking, good at social media vibe, but translating that into real action becomes then problematic. But a second point that I'll perhaps want to make as I come towards the end, with regards to the top level, the governance level, the political leadership level perhaps, is the fact I think that a point that was made earlier, which is that for many Africans, they feel like the problems that are being experienced in the US are actually worse on the African continent itself. I think Michael did allude to the case of this South African gentleman of nearly the same age as Gorge Floyd, who was killed during the lockdown by the military, in fact, dying out there in an informal settlement known as Alexandra, right next to Sandton, in almost similar circumstances to Gorge Floyd's death in Minneapolis. And therefore, the question then has arisen is when you talk of governments taking up this matter and articulating it pretty at a high level, Africans actually question the bona fide, the justification for these leaders doing that, and because they are perpetrators, or at least they are seen as perpetrators of injustices themselves. I think I just would like to end by the fact that it has been noted that leaders actually from the president of Ghana to South African President Cyril Ramaphosa did issue statements, but I doubt that they were strong enough. Someone will ask, how strong did you want them to be? But you actually just look at the framing. You can tell, as a student of discourse analysis, you look at what has gone into the writing of the statement and compare it with what is available. And you realize very quickly that they were not very strong statements. In fact, the Africa Union chairman, Musa Faki, statement was hardly a paragraph. And in it it was very terse and it has no punch. It is not the kind that will excite me to get off my seat and go into the streets. For that reason, I feel like it was just tokenism from the African continent. It is as if the leaders were saying we must be seen to have said something, even if we do not necessarily mean it. And therefore one wonders what the fear is. Is there a fear that you do not want to upset the Trump administration? Or is it that we just have disconnected and so forth? And I think I'll stop here. Those will be my views, my points at this point in time.
Bob, thank you very much for the reflections on African positions, very contradictory positions, but very interesting area of research. How does the African public respond to issues around the US, particularly around a bigger issue like this? So thank you again for that intervention. Then what we are going to do now is to go through some of the questions. What I thought I would do is to begin with the question that was raised before we took the break. And all the contributors actually are welcome to respond to that question. The question was about whether African countries should in fact issue travel advisories to the US. I think it speaks to some of the issues that were raised in this panel, particularly what Bob is saying. How feasible is that kind of policy on African governments issuing travel advisories? So anyway, if you can pick it up in your responses at some point, I don't think that should be a problem. The first question we have for this session is actually from a panelist who is asking a question that was raised from the previous discussion about, can the Democrats maintain their momentum at this point? Can Biden maintain his momentum? And it's related to what Francis was talking about earlier. So if we could just get maybe a quick response on that before we go to the other questions.
I'll give my thoughts on those two. I'm going to start actually with the first point that you mentioned on the travel ban, because that's an interesting point, because what did come up was that the things that are happening in the US had some people look at what constitutes a refugee under South African law. And they were saying, but hey, African Americans qualify to be refugees. We should come up with a whole package. And, it didn't go far, but this idea of, I guess, punishing the US or putting out a travel advisory on, traveling to the US is going to be bad for your health. I don't know. I think the bigger issue will be related to COVID. Because right now that's what stopped flights from happening. Long term, it's difficult to me in that regard because of the relationships that Africa has with the U.S. and the role that the U.S. plays from an economic standpoint. I see it unlikely that when I think of the airlines that fly, KQ, Kenya Airways, Ethiopian Airlines. South Africa Airways, if it stays afloat. Those are also some of the most lucrative routes for those airlines. So there would be a significant economic impact to trying to do that. Symbolic, maybe, but I don't see that happening. With the Democrats, I think that Biden has another issue, like a crucible to cross, to me, which is going to be his selection of a running mate, which is still heavily political and laden, and he hasn't dealt with it yet. But either one that he chooses, I'm worried that those who are pulling for someone else, there'll be a backlash. So if he has he said he's going to have a woman. If he has a white woman, will black women support that woman? If he has a white woman, if he has a white woman, will white people overall support his ticket? Because he's at an age where, heart attack, any kind of health issue, that woman becomes the president. And race is now front and center in everything that we do. So I think the path for Biden is still one that he's got to navigate a whole lot of things. And I also don't think that the race has hotted up yet, meaning the negative attacks. I mean, they were a little bit there when they were going after his son, et cetera. But I think that's going to heat up. So the only thing that I think people are cognizant of is that this time in 2016, Democrats were quite confident. All the polls said, Secretary of State Clinton had a lead. And I won't say we were coasting or she got complacent, but it almost seemed at the end that she snatched defeat out of the jaws of victory. So people, I think this time around will be much more diligent up until the last vote is cast to make sure that there's no complacency, period.
Yeah,
And Amata, could you jump in here before Francis?
Have an opinion on the Democrats. I would echo what Michael said. As far as the travel ban, yes, that is symbolic. I think, this tepid response that I alluded to and that Bob has outlined of African governments in response to what's going on here, perhaps, some kind of decree about travel might, make them look a little bit better. But I agree with Michael that it would just be symbolic. There are too many eyes on the continent looking towards the United States to make, any kind of travel ban or travel advisory anything but symbolic. My 2 cents.
Gilbert, can I jump in here?
Yeah.
The cynics are saying that if Joe Biden wants to win in November, all he has to do now is just keep quiet. And Donald Trump will continue to do those things which will so irrevocably erode any hope of victory and so chase away moderate people, white, suburban, college-educated women, which used to be in play for Republicans, but which are now decisively swinging toward Democrats. Realistically, Joe Biden has to say something. And the last 2 presentations that he gave, albeit on video, I could sit there and look at them. My wife looked at them. I talked to some friends and they said, my goodness, Joe Biden is beginning to find his voice for this year, for this campaign. Now, I think Michael's absolutely right that the next hurdle is picking somebody to be his vice presidential candidate. But there's another thought that some columnists have begun to express and that I tend to think is the right thing to do, is to name a group of 10 to 20 people that he says up front now, or very shortly, will be members of my cabinet, and to list people of such probity, such standing, and such public recognition that they all become surrogates for him. They all become people who can fan out across the country and be the people who will speak on his behalf, whether they're Black or white or male or female, or whether they're currently in federal office or in some other circumstance. But he has got to build on the momentum that says, I will be party to a government which reconciles, which brings together, which unites, rather than this extraordinary divisiveness that I was speaking about right at the beginning. And that should, other things being equal, help him across the finish line. But of course, this year, everything is not equal to every other election in the past. There is still the virus, there is still the shutdowns, there are still extraordinary efforts to limit voting by people in a number of states, mostly Midwestern and Southern. And there is always the possibility of, I'll put it out there, it's good for Republicans, perhaps bad for Democrats in some strange way, an economic recovery. That would, more than anything else, assist Donald Trump in a recovery. Because if you remember the Bill Clinton slogan from 1992, I believe, was in all the campaign headquarters after a while. And it read very simply, it's the economy, comma, stupid. In other words, remember, there's one thing to pay attention to, and that's the economy. I went back and looked at presidents seeking re-election back as far as 1892. No president, with the exception of Franklin Roosevelt, won in in the midst of a depression or recession that was not ending. And Roosevelt's example, of course, is unique in that set of circumstances.
Brooks, thank you very much. Francis, could you jump in here quickly and then we can move on?
Yeah. No, I think that Brooks makes a very telling point in terms of how Biden should navigate announcing a running mate, because the unique circumstance that he is in is that he's quite likely to be a one-term president in terms of what he has already put out there that he would hand over to, that he would not seek another term. So the thing is that his vice presidential choice is going to be very critical. And I think there are important strengths and weaknesses to just about everybody, that's been named, so that were he to name a cabinet, I think that would place him in a much better position politically. I mean, say for example, let's say for example, chooses Elizabeth Warren as his vice presidential running mate, and then he names Kamala Harris as Attorney General, or Susan Rice as Secretary of Defense. Those are the kinds of things that I think that he will have to do in order to maintain momentum. And beyond that, I think that the Democrats have got to, and this is something where they are just very frustratingly weak. They're not good in terms of aggressive messaging and propaganda. And this is something, in spite of their advantages and in spite of all of the ammunition that they don't seem to have a strategy of putting it together in order to go for the jugular. And as Mike said, I mean, we have not gotten into the nitty gritty yet. And so, but actually Biden's silence so far has helped him. Trump has just done it on his own.
Thank you, Francis. Can I abuse the position of the chair to ask a question to Nelima and Nemata? The Black Lives Movement has been with us for so many years. And I think, Nemata, you mentioned that in your presentation. Why are things different now? Why has the Gorge Floyd murder taken on this this kind of vehemence that we never saw previously? I just want an explanation to that question.
I mean, I'm sorry. My opinion is that the visual of it, not that we haven't seen this visual before. We saw the first I Can't Breathe man in New York. Why am I blanking out on his name? The man who was killed in New York, whose last words were, "I can't breathe." So we've seen video before. We saw Ahmaud Arbery being shot in broad daylight, essentially. So I don't think it's just the visual, but I think the combination of, being in lockdown for, this is just my personal opinion, being in lockdown and then seeing these things and feeling helpless. At least that's how I personally felt, enough to, to spew my rant on somebody's blog. But, the combination of all of these things, this feeling of helplessness, I think in some ways, and anger combined, is for me, the way I explain it to myself, why this response in the case of Gorge Floyd. It's not a very, it's a very personal response, and that's how I've explained it to myself. Just a combination of a variety of things.
Sure. I mean, I agree with Nemata I share the same sentiments with Nemata the one thing I will add is that we know there have been police shootings before, there have been videos before, etc. And I think I have been contemplating on this issue, and to me, it has become also additionally very annoying, very hurtful to me, because I think it solidifies the sentiments of how white the life of white people is valued over the life of Black people. In the case of George Floyd, I think what we had, two things I'll say. What we had for the first time is a complete video of a Black man who was handcuffed and literally on the ground with 3 police officers pinning him down. So there was complete and questionable evidence. If we have to be very honest with ourselves, in the past incidents, even though there have been some videos, there have been some questions about the beginning, like how did it start? Did the police officer really feel threatened? Was Jamar Clark really handcuffed, or not? How did Amadou Diallo's wallet look like in his pocket when he was shot with 23 bullets? Did it really look like a gun? Did Philando Castile really have a gun? How did he react when the officer approached him? There was always that question. And to me, I think that it is this endemic problem of Black people not being believed. Because to us, we have known these things for a fact. There were eyewitnesses when Jamar Clark saying clearly Jamar Clark was handcuffed and on the ground when he was shot by the police officers, but there was not a video suggesting that. And in the past, there have been all these grainy police videos, and you cannot see the face of the officer. I think I was watching last night when Ava DuVernay was saying on the opera special about, even for her as an artist and a writer, one of the things that was disturbing, and I think to very many people, is in this instant, we saw the murderer, the police officer, very casually with his hand in his pocket, just resting his knee on top of this black man's neck. And even though we've had a history of lynching and etc., it is a good thing that there's a worldwide movement, but it is also very painful that what we have known and what African Americans have known historically, that it is possible that Black lives are so devalued that somebody can actually just lynch somebody and shoot somebody for no reason at all. We have not been believed. We have not been believed in the past, that there's always been this lingering question. And for the first time, actually a 17-year-old Black girl actually had the brevity to stand steady and record the whole incident. And that is why there's this, so in addition to all these other things, there's this lingering question about how Black people are believed or not. And the one thing I'll quickly say, remember, this is on the heels of Amy Cooper. If people know about Amy Cooper, the white woman who was in the park, when she picked up the phone and casually told this Black man, I am going to call the police and I am going to tell them a Black man is threatening my life. She knew as a white woman, she can casually pick up the phone and lie, and she is going to be believed as a white woman, especially when it comes to her feeling threatened by a Black man. So on the one hand, even though it is great that, there's a lot of work that has been done, so I don't want to discount that. Yes, there was the issue of the pandemic, but I cannot help but to think about it also centers on the fact that Black people have not really been believed, especially by white society the world over. There's always been this question of making up excuses for the white police officers who have been murdering Black people. And just summing it up, it's the same reason we talk about all the time. Barack Obama had to be squeaky clean to become the first president of the United States. It is this continuous, very super, high standard that Black people have to continually meet to be approved and to be believed and for us to be valued.
Thank you very much. Bob, there is a question for you from Felix, which says, could we also say that the Floyd protests are increasingly taking local inflections, at least going by what is happening in Kenyan social media?
Right, I think certainly so, and I believe I alluded to that in my presentation. And there's just, the short answer is yes. And in fact, even though it is taken, those inflections are seen in Kenya, Nigeria, and so forth, I think the South African case is particularly poignant in the sense that when the ANC government announced that today there's gonna be a national protest, and that the ANC, I think the president and the ANC machinery was calling on South Africa to put on black as a demonstration of solidarity with George Floyd and African Americans and protests of the Black Lives Matter nature. The quick question that then arose was, but in the first place, how was Koza, this black man, who was also 46, how was he killed? Why did the ANC government and the Ramaphosa government, why did it not react to the killing of a South African who is also, for 6 years, also living in poverty, very many parallels that seem to be similar. And therefore, yes, I think there's a great reinterpretation, not just in Kenya, in fact, not just in South Africa, but across the continent. We've seen a situation where I think there's some call coming in somewhere. Okay, so I think I'll just conclude by saying that yes, for every single African country, society, and so forth, a reflection on George Floyd has been interpreted in a quintessentially local, region-specific circumstance with the development and dynamics that of real or reality. Or demonstrate real situations in every one of the 55 African countries.
And if I can just jump in, Gilbert, to say that, this idea also on the part of many Africans of the economic injustices, right, that they face is an important contribution to it becoming local on the continent. So one of the slides that I had up there, right, was that article by Mukhtar Karim. He says Africa is enslaved in debt. Black lives should all matter, whether in Minneapolis or Mombasa, right? And so I think Africans are picking up on this idea that we too, as he says, Black lives matter. If you can't solve the problem of economic injustice for African Americans without also thinking about Africa. And I think Africans are making those connections on the continent.
Gilbert, I just want to add one point that also comes to mind in that space that Namata was talking about. The reactions from Africans on the continent, the reactions from Africans who are living in the US does beg the question or illuminate the fact that there's still need for more dialogue between Africans from the continent and African Americans to understand each person's perspective. One of the comments that I saw was, it was on the African side saying, how come African Americans are saying Black Lives Matter? They should be saying African Lives Matter. Seems they've forgotten their roots. And that for an African American, it would be you're out of touch with what I'm dealing with. But for an African, you're the sons and daughters we sent to the States or were taken from the continent to the States. You should be reaching out to us. So there's still a lot of space for engagement, and this killing of George Floyd brings some of that in terms of the responses that you get to the forefront. I think out of it though, there will be, again, from those on the African side, on the US side, when the flights do come back, I think there'll be a boon in tourism to the continent, particularly by African Americans wanting to, just explore more. Because in this whole discussion, you've had white Americans saying, well, if they don't like it here, why don't they go back to Africa? These are some of the things you see on the news. So some of the people are like, well, maybe I should explore Africa. Essence festival that takes place in New Orleans. It took place in Ghana. And you know, so there's, in terms of the engagement between Africans and African Americans, I think there's some positives, but this also illuminates the fact that our base reaction is a personal one and localized one when we look at these issues. If something happens on the continent, you know, African Americans would look at it like, whoa, that's far away from me. So I don't hold it against Africans for looking at something happening in the US if you've never left your country, to saying that's a bit far away from me. But, you know, as Bob mentioned, there are intellectuals, people who've studied that side, et cetera. But then you localize. Could I take that kind of protest that's happening in the US and do it on the streets in my country and protest some injustice? And many people would say, no, you know, that wouldn't be possible. So a lot of factors in this. And I just wanted to raise those points.
But it shouldn't be a lost opportunity on the part of people on the continent, right? Historically, it's been African Americans who've been speaking, at least a segment of African American society that has spoken out on behalf of Africa, as I've outlined. I think this is African opportunity to speak out on behalf of African Americans, to say very strongly, which I have not seen it as strong, a strong statement coming out of the continent to say, you know, we now as Africans are speaking on behalf of our brothers and sisters in Africa in the way that African Americans have historically, and sometimes in problematic ways, have done. I don't, you know, this is, and you know, I hope it's not a lost opportunity. And
But I'll just also add, you are mute, but I think Gilbert was mute, but let me just say what, okay. Gilbert, you are mute. You are saying something, yeah. But you are mute.
No, I was saying that that question is important because you raised it in your presentation. If we could give you the final word to reflect on the question, why not more robust African responses?
I think one of the points that I was mulling over as I was preparing for this discussion was to look at perhaps the question of leadership. And I think this is a point I alluded to. A protest doesn't just happen. As I think, I'm sure Nelima and Michael and maybe any people who have been involved in mobilizing, there is a lot of calls to be made. There is a lot of communication. There's a lot of issues to do with tactics, and getting out people. Organizing emergency situations, first aid if there will be need for that, and so forth. And I think that hasn't been seen on the continent. One, I think number two, one will understand why the protest will be higher in the US. In Europe, perhaps again it comes to the same point. The Africans in Europe face the similar circumstances as those in the US, and equally they have community leaders that will help and so forth. And I think one of the other major factors then on the continent why perhaps it didn't quite gain that much traction is the COVID-19 itself. The lockdowns are still in place, and in the African context, the lockdowns have been quite strict and militarized. In South Africa, the army, there is no police, but the army was on the streets actually. In Kenya, almost like on the first day of the curfew, the police came out in full force and beat people with batons, breaking limbs and so forth. So I think people are just cringing from the measures that were heavy-handed in many places, and therefore that might have been a problem. However, perhaps this gives me an opportunity perhaps to say a way forward is actually to go to what Michael is saying and consider the possibility of organizations that are working from an African American perspective and working with organizations on the continent to perhaps do the simplest we can, which is put out a statement, a powerful enough statement, a statement that can be looked at by many eyes so that it communicates something and in a powerful way. After all, we've seen entities such as African Studies Association do statements from the US. We've seen in my own field, the International Communications and Media Research Association has put out a statement, but really we haven't seen that robust statement coming from here. So I think my proposal will be that we can put our heads together and put together, at least if nothing else, a powerful statements that communicates solidarity and so forth. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bob. I think we've run out of time, and I want to take this opportunity to thank all the speakers, all the presenters for their excellent remarks. And I also want to thank members of the audience. At this session, there were mostly comments, not questions. So I'm very happy that we got an opportunity to engage each other across the forum. The Africa Center, as I said from the outset, has committed itself to engaging around US issues. So this is a very good opportunity for us to showcase that, in fact, we are engaging on matters that are very much African, but also on matters that are very American. But I also want to make it clear that this is the beginning of our conversation or conversations around what does the United States mean for Africa and what does Africa mean for the United States. About a month ago, we had a forum on the new and old diaspora, which brought a lot of scholars from the US and from Africa to probe the issue around how can we look at the new and old diasporas and their contributions to enhancing knowledge about the two continents. So I'm very happy that we are continuing with this discussion. Gorge Floyd has given us an opportunity to revisit the question about what does it mean, what does African America mean to Africa, and how can Africa respond to issues that are African American. And so I'm very happy that we could have this discussion. I know that Brooks Spector and Francis Carnegie are very much interested in US elections. We are going to have another forum on the meaning of the US elections in a couple of months, maybe a few forums on the elections and Africa. And the Gorge Floyd issue has come out at a very appropriate moment when we can, in fact, zero in on what is the meaning of the African American vote and to the future of US elections. So these are conversations that we are continuing to have, and I'm very happy that we have a big group of supporters like Michael Sudarsky, Nemata, and all the other people who are able to tune in and contribute to what we are doing as the Africa Center for the Study of the US, even though we are living in very difficult times, but at least we can still continue to interact with you virtually. And you should also go to our website, and we're doing some publications on not just on US-Africa relations, but on COVID-19 and all the implications of this crisis, or the two pandemics that I mentioned from the outset. So I want to let you go and again express my gratitude for your participation on this event this afternoon. And I'm wishing you a good weekend. I think in South Africa we have June 16th, which is on Tuesday, the Youth Day. So I wish you a happy Youth Day for those of you who are in South Africa. And thank you again, and God bless.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, bye.
Thank you. Good seeing you all.